Chasing Legends: The Life of a Cryptid Hunter, Part 1. Dr. Samuel Grayson considered himself a scientist first and a cryptozoologist second. Others might have dismissed his work as pseudoscience, but to him, the search for Bigfoot was a logical pursuit, an unsolved biological anomaly that demanded empirical observation. He had spent years compiling witness reports, footprint casts, and alleged vocalizations. Now, after months of preparation, he was finally in the field, ready to conduct a long-term study deep in the heart of Washington's Olympic National Forest. He'd decided on this location, as he found the evidence and reported sightings in this area to be the most compelling. The first week passed uneventfully, with nothing but long hikes, setting camera traps, and taking detailed notes. Several sleepless nights were spent listening to the rustling of the vast, breathing wilderness, hoping to record the distant howl of a Sasquatch. He set up camp near a remote creek bed, miles from any official trail. His research involved meticulous documentation, recording every snapped branch, every overturned rock, every anomaly that might hint at the presence of something unusual. It wasn't until the 9th day that he found his first clue. A massive primate-shaped footprint pressed deep into the soft clay mud next to a small rushing creek. It was a fresh print, leaving Dr. Grayson both nervous and delighted at the same time. The size alone ruled out a bear, nearly 18 inches long, with a stride that suggested something large, bipedal, and powerful. He crouched beside it, measuring and photographing, his pulse quickening with excitement. If this was real, if it wasn't a hoax or misidentification, then he was closer than anyone had ever been to proving the existence of an undiscovered primate species. His hands shook with anticipation. Over the next few days, more fascinating evidence emerged. Clumps of coarse, dark hair were found snagged randomly on tree bark and branches. The doctor removed each of them with the tweezers from his handy toolkit, carefully depositing them into plastic sandwich bags. There were also a couple of enormous, humanoid-looking handprints smudged onto a nearby moss-covered rock face that he spent nearly an hour studying and photographing. Another thing he was puzzled by were several strange formations of sticks, almost like rudimentary markers, that seemed deliberately left on his path. It was quite obvious the sticks had been placed carefully, strategically, in the middle of the walkway. Clearly someone, or something, was leaving a message. However, the most unsettling discovery for Dr. Grayson came when he awoke one morning to find his campsite had been disturbed. Not destroyed or ransacked per se, just touched. His cooking gear had been moved. His notepad, which he swore he had left in his tent, now lay open outside, pages fluttering in the breeze. Something had been here during the night, watching, studying him. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Why had he not woken up? He shook his head in disappointment at himself. That night, the forest somehow shifted. At first, the changes were rather subtle. The most noticeable was the absence of familiar sounds. No insects chirping, no rustling nocturnal creatures, just a heavy, oppressive silence, pressing against him like a weighted blanket. As Dr. Grayson lay there wondering at the sudden silence, out of nowhere came a sort of crashing noise just outside his tent. Intrigued, yet undeniably nervous, he stepped outside the meager shelter. A fist-sized stone, hurled from the darkness, had landed within a few feet from where he had been laying, skidding to a stop just outside the open flap. He jumped as another rather large rock landed too close for his comfort. Then another, and another. He stepped away from the growing pile of rocks, scanning the tree line with his flashlight. "Who's there?" His voice sounded surprisingly steady, though his hands trembled slightly. Silence. He was about to call out again when from deep within the forest came a howl. A long, low, guttural sound that reverberated through the trees. Dr. Stanley had spent enough time in nature to know it wasn't a wolf or coyote. It definitely wasn't human. It was something else, a sound he'd never heard before. And if he were being honest with himself, he never wanted to hear it again. The rock throwing continued sporadically through the next several hours, as though whatever was out there was testing him, gauging his reaction. He slept very little that night, and by dawn he was utterly exhausted. This was what he had come for, he reminded himself. He reluctantly crawled out of his warm sleeping bag into the brisk morning air. If they wanted him to leave, it was a good sign. It meant he was getting closer. The next day, he pressed on, going much deeper into the woods. As he moved further into the dense forest, he found more footprints, more disturbances. He felt watched at every turn, an almost palpable presence trailing him just beyond his line of sight. As evening's darkness approached, he reached a ridge overlooking a densely wooded valley, now bathed in the glow of the setting sun. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a movement, something large shifting in the underbrush. Likely a black bear or mountain lion, he told himself, nodding slowly as if that would help make the lie more believable. Then it emerged. His stomach dropped as if he were on a roller coaster. If only. The creature, no, the primate, was around 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its thick, dark fur was heavily matted and coated with dirt and debris, as if it had been rolling on the ground. Broad shoulders with thick, muscular limbs promised brute strength. The face staring back at him, however, was eerily human. No, almost human, but not quite. Its brow was heavy with a strong jaw and deep-set, coal-black eyes. Dr. Grayson had never felt so weak and vulnerable, compared to the creature before him that exuded raw animal power. Caught between fight and flight, he instead stood there mesmerized, in terror. Then it snarled. Not an animalistic growl, not a warning exactly. It was something deeper, filled with unmistakable intent. It was trying to communicate a message. The doctor took an involuntary step back, silently cursing himself for showing fear. The enormous creature mimicked him by stepping forward, his deep-set black eyes never leaving Dr. Grayson's face. The message was now coming across unmistakably clear. Leave. He did as instructed. Without a second thought, he turned and ran as fast as his body, and the dense, ever-darkening forest around him would allow. His usual calm demeanor and controlled scientific mind were completely shattered by pure survival instinct. Branches whipped against his exposed arms and face, the trees blurring around him as he sprinted over the uneven forest floor. Behind him, heavy footfalls thundered through the underbrush, matching his pace. It wasn't just following him, it was chasing him. A deafening roar split the air. The sound reverberated in his chest, primal and overwhelming. Dr. Grayson didn't stop, couldn't stop, though his lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest. He kept running, navigating blindly through the darkened forest, fueled by pure fear and adrenaline. Then, ahead he saw his camp, his vehicle. Relief flooded through him. Salvation was near. He reached his truck, utter terror making him shake uncontrollably as he fumbled through his pockets for his keys. Through his panic, he managed to get his truck unlocked, promptly throwing himself inside and quickly locking the doors. For a long moment, he sat there, gasping for air as he tried to catch his breath. His hands clenching the wheel in a death grip of fear as a wave of nausea made its way through his exhausted body. He forced his eyes up to look out the window, waiting for the inevitable impact of something slamming against the vehicle. But strangely it never came. The forest remained unsettlingly still, empty, as though nothing had ever been there. The trauma of the last few minutes propelled Dr. Grayson to start the engine, and he peeled out onto the narrow forest road. Dirt and gravel sprayed behind his truck as he sped down the pothole-laden lane, muttering a prayer that his shocks and tires held up until he reached safety. He didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town. The blinking neon sign of a truck stop invited him to pull over and decompress. He found a spot at an empty end of the parking lot, where he sat quietly in his truck staring blankly at the dashboard, his mind replaying the insane events that had unfolded only a short time ago. He had gone looking for proof. He had found it. He even had the fur samples and footprint casts to take back to the lab as proof. He had proof of Bigfoot. This would probably make him quite famous. He pictured himself recounting his adventures on the morning news. His book would be on the New York Times bestseller list. The little side hobby that earned him ridicule from family and friends would finally pay off. He could say, "Ha! I told you so." Out of nowhere, a nagging feeling invaded his little fantasy. What would happen to these creatures if proof was made public? He didn't want to think of the numerous hunters vying to be the first to bag one. How many more would want one as a trophy to add to their collection? Even zoos would be trying to get in on the action. This didn't sit well with Dr. Grayson. What he encountered in the forest was, while not quite human, it was close enough to being human. He squirmed uncomfortably in his truck seat, pondering the ethics of his dilemma. After a few moments of deliberation, his mind was made up. The creature had let him live, and their shared sense of humanity demanded he return the favor. Please help us grow and subscribe to our channel.